They thought it would be over by Christmas. That was Hitler's fatal mistake. As the German war machine stormed toward Moscow in 1941, victory felt inevitable, but then everything unraveled. Engines froze, soldiers starved, and the Red Army, once in retreat, turned into a savage winter force. What followed wasn't just a failed invasion, it was the beginning of Hitler's downfall. This is the brutal, frostbitten story of how snow, steel, and Soviet defiance shattered the Nazi dream.
Meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
The invasion that was supposed to be blitzkrieg. By the summer of 1941, Hitler was riding high. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Poland was crushed. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands all blitzed into submission. And now, Operation Barbarossa was set in motion, a colossal invasion of the Soviet Union involving nearly 4 million Axis troops. Hitler believed Russia would collapse, just like everyone else. He thought the Soviets were weak, backward, and unprepared. His generals warned against underestimating them, but he didn't listen. Moscow was to be taken quickly, ideally by October. Then the Red Army would be decapitated and the Eastern Front sealed. In the early days, it looked like Hitler might be right. The German army raced through the western USSR. Soviet divisions were encircled, annihilated. Prisoners were captured by the hundreds of thousands. Cities fell one by one. The Nazi propaganda machine boasted that Russia was a rotten structure that would collapse with one solid push. But they misjudged something massive: Russia's depth and its winter. The march toward Moscow turns into a crawl. By September, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles, but the deeper they went into the Soviet Union, the more their problems grew. Supply lines stretched thin, roads turned to mud in the autumn rains. Rail lines had to be rebuilt to match German gauges, and Soviet resistance, instead of collapsing, got nastier. Still, Hitler pressed on. He split his forces between 3 targets: Leningrad in the north, the oil fields in the south, and the crown jewel, Moscow. That was mistake number 1, dividing his strength. Mistake number 2, underestimating the Soviet winter. German soldiers marched in summer uniforms. Their tanks weren't winterized. Many didn't even have proper boots. The plan was to finish the campaign before winter hit, but October arrived and the snow started falling. Suddenly, the Wehrmacht, the most advanced military machine in the world, was bogged down in a frigid hell. Operation Typhoon, the final push for Moscow. In October, Hitler launched Operation Typhoon, a full assault on Moscow. He poured in men, tanks, artillery. It was do or die. The Germans made quick progress at first, getting within 85 miles of Moscow by early November. Soviet forces were exhausted, losing ground, and low on morale. But Stalin wasn't about to abandon his capital. He declared martial law and began evacuating civilians. Troops flooded in from Siberia, toughened veterans trained to fight in snow and sub-zero temperatures. These reinforcements had been freed up thanks to Soviet intelligence confirming Japan wouldn't attack from the east. Now it was Stalin's turn to go all in, and the temperature dropped. Fast. The weather turns deadly. By late November, temperatures near Moscow dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius, minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, then minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Soon it reached a jaw-dropping minus 40 degrees Celsius, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. For the Germans, it was catastrophic. Engines wouldn't start. Oil turned to sludge. Guns jammed. Medical supplies froze. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspapers to stay warm. Entire regiments suffered frostbite. Horses collapsed in the snow. The Germans hadn't even been issued winter coats. And then came the blizzards, turning trenches into ice coffins. Meanwhile, the Soviets were in their element. Their tanks were built for cold, their uniforms were fur-lined, their snipers prowled the white forests, and their morale, sky high. For the first time, German troops started retreating, not because of Soviet bullets, but because of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. The Soviet counterattack shocks the Nazis. On December 5th, just one day before the Germans planned a renewed offensive, the Soviets struck first. It was brutal. Thousands of ski troops, Siberian soldiers, and T-34 tanks rolled out across the snow-covered plains. They smashed through thin German lines. They used speed, camouflage, and surprise. Nazi commanders were blindsided. Hitler ordered no retreat, but it was chaos. Soldiers froze in trenches, unable to move. Tanks were abandoned, artillery left behind, supply depots burned. This wasn't just a counterattack, it was a rout. By January 1942, the Germans had been pushed back up to 150 miles from Moscow. The dream of capturing the Soviet capital had died in the snow, and Hitler's image of invincibility shattered. The psychological collapse of the Wehrmacht. The winter of 1941 wasn't just a military failure, it was a psychological one. German troops had marched across Europe practically untouched, but in the forests outside Moscow they met their match, and more. For the first time they realized this wasn't going to be easy, it wasn't going to be quick, and it might not even be winnable. Officers began to question Hitler's strategy. Generals warned that without proper winter gear and reinforcements, the Eastern Front would become a graveyard. Morale plummeted, deserters increased, suicide rates among frozen, starving troops spiked. Meanwhile, Stalin seized the moment. He made speeches rallying the Soviet people. Propaganda posters declared, "Not one step back." Children built trenches, women packed grenades. The Red Army wasn't broken, it was just getting started. Hitler's strategic blunders multiply. What made the failure outside Moscow worse was Hitler's refusal to adapt. When generals begged for retreats to save lives and stabilize the front, Hitler refused. He micromanaged from afar, trusting his gut over his officers. One general described the campaign as a war of ghosts, because by the time Hitler issued orders, the situation on the ground had changed completely. This stubbornness would become a pattern. From Stalingrad to Normandy, Hitler would ignore expert advice, cling to fantasies of domination, and drag his army deeper into disaster. The battle for Moscow was just the beginning, the cost in lives and machines. By the end of the winter campaign, German losses were staggering. Over 500,000 troops killed, wounded, or missing. Thousands of tanks destroyed. Entire divisions had to be pulled off the front and rebuilt from scratch. Soviet losses were even higher, over 900,000 casualties, but they held the line. And more importantly, they proved to themselves and the world the Nazi war machine could be stopped. Factories in the Ural Mountains ramped up production. New armies were being trained. The Red Army had tasted blood, and now they wanted revenge. The tide was turning. Why the Nazis really failed in Moscow? It wasn't just the cold. Yes, the winter was savage, but winters come every year in Russia. The real reasons the Nazis failed were arrogance. Hitler believed the Soviets would fold in weeks. He was wrong. Logistics. Supply lines broke down, fuel ran out, roads were impassable. Poor planning. No winter gear, no backup plans, no flexibility. Soviet grit. The Red Army refused to die. Reinforcements were relentless. Stalin's ruthlessness. He purged, imprisoned, and sacrificed, but he never gave up. Geography. Russia is massive. Every mile the Germans advanced made them weaker. In short, Hitler bet everything on a knockout blow, but when Moscow held, the illusion of Nazi dominance cracked. How this changed the entire war. After Moscow, the myth of German invincibility was dead. Allies took notice. American aid to the Soviets increased. Resistance movements in occupied Europe found new energy. And inside Germany, quiet doubt began to creep in. For the Soviets, it was a turning point. They began pushing westward, city by city, battle by battle. Stalingrad, Kursk, Leningrad, eventually Berlin. Without the failure at Moscow, there's no Soviet comeback. No D-Day, no Cold War superpower split. It all started with a freezing, furious stand outside a city Hitler thought would fall in weeks. Legacy of the Moscow campaign. Today, historians still argue over just how close the Nazis came to capturing Moscow. Some say they could have done it if they hadn't split their forces. Others argue the Soviet defense was always too strong. But what's clear is this: the winter of 1941 changed everything. It was the first time someone had stood up to the full force of Nazi Germany and won. It was the moment the world realized that Hitler could be beaten. And it was the moment that millions of Soviets, suffering through hunger and terror, decided they'd rather freeze to death than see that swastika fly over the Kremlin. A battle of ice, fire, and iron will. The Battle of Moscow isn't as famous as D-Day or Stalingrad, but it was the first domino. It proved that steel tanks mean nothing if they're frozen solid, that ideology collapses when faced with real-world logistics, and that sometimes the fiercest weapon of all is the human will to endure. Hitler's Eastern dream died in the snow, and from that frostbitten grave rose the Soviet vengeance that would end the war.